Good evening, everybody. Wow, so I get this wonderful privilege. Um, Urbana School District 116. Um, I've probably had some affiliation or known a lot of people that worked there for many, many years. Urbana has been an inclusive early childhood program since I believe it's 99. Is that true? I can't see on the other. Let me move over here. 1990. But the rumor on the street is that they have actually um, been an inclusive early childhood program since 1983. And most of you probably don't even remember 1983. I know I do. Because I figured I did the math. I was 29 years old and probably had just recently finished my work at the U of I, and I had done some practicum and student teaching in Urbana. So I've had this relationship and have gotten to know certainly Chris Vowles, who is the principal administrator there in Urbana, who drives this big ship and does certainly a commendable job at doing that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a second. So in about 1983, if you stick to the rumor that I'm starting, they were in a variety of elementary schools in the Urbana School District. And something really great and magical happened around 2012 when they built a new early childhood center. I know they opened their Urbana Early Childhood Center in 2012, which is a beautiful center. Maybe some of you have had a chance to visit, and if you haven't, maybe it's something to put on your wish list, maybe for the future. Some of you, maybe the administrators, had a chance to visit when we had the administrative forum in Urbana, and I know many administrators told me that they had a chance to visit. They took pictures, they met with Chris and some of the wonderful staff, and they came back and used the pictures for professional learning opportunities in their districts. So that was really great and powerful. So they received the Award of Excellence in Inclusion. That was just some times back, but not that long ago. I think they were one of the first districts in Illinois who got that very prestigious award. And as you can see here on the screen, on the slide, we see some percentages here, but we kind of all are a little familiar, those of us that follow the LRE data. We call it EE, Educational Environment Data here in Illinois. We speak to 6A and 6B are the two that oftentimes we look at in Urbana in 6A, and that's where children spend the majority of their day in general education. And here, we wanted you to know that all of their students are in 6A. So they are with their typically developing peers. So in Urbana, that's PFA and PFAE, and in the community, there's a variety of places that children go for early childhood, for their early childhood program. And that is where also the children with the most significant disabilities are. So they are with their typically developing peers in the early childhood center. And also, Urbana has 2 preschool for all PFAE classrooms in Martin Luther King Elementary School, which Chris oversees that administratively as well too. So like I said, Chris is the principal. She certainly has driven this for many, many years, and she is to be commended. And so I encourage you, Chris is going to be around a while longer, and we want to take advantage of her administrative skills. So please jot down the information, get to know Chris, and maybe someday you can go visit and meet her. And I know she would love to give you a tour of the building. She's very proud of the program, and she should be. And she's always very kind about doing that, taking time, to give you the tour, to sit down so you can ask questions. And like I said, many who have had that chance and have done that have walked away feeling that they gained so much. So that's a little bit about Urbana, and that 0%, which I just really want to point out here, which is 6B, and that's where children spend the majority of their day outside of the general ed place, that they have no children in segregated programs. So today, we just really have this great opportunity to hear from Elise and Katie about how they do that, because that's pretty awesome. And I'm sure you are sitting there wondering, wow, how do they possibly make that happen? So we'll move on to the next. So I'm sure you're all curious about Katie and Elise, what their role looks like in Urbana 116. You don't want to hear from us. So they're the ones, they're doing it every day. And so we want to hear from you. And so if you would, we'd like for both of you to certainly speak to us about your role and begin to paint that picture for everybody on the webinar of what that looks like. Pretty extensive role, so we're excited to hear.
Sure. So typically we have around 40 students on our caseload. Obviously, that's a mixture of students with just speech and language goals, as well as students that have more significant needs, so OT, PT, social work. And then we also go in once per classroom session to do a large group language or phonological awareness lesson. And so typically that's about twice a day, and then 4 times a week typically. And then we also do, so my role is a little bit different. So my caseload's a little smaller. I have 2 classrooms instead of 4 because I do all the evaluations for children coming in from outside of our school. So early intervention, students from Head Start, and from other schools that, more private schools that we have in the area. So that's a role that I have as well. And then we also do initial evaluations for students who don't enter with an IEP. So sometimes we have children coming in from our screening that we have concerns about. We monitor them a little bit in the classroom, and then if the teachers and ourselves still have concerns, then we would start an initial evaluation for that student based on what they need.
Some of the other things we do are we're often highly involved in the screening process. So when a family calls to make a screening appointment, they are asked if they have any concerns, and if they mention speech, then we're brought in advance. But it does happen where we're in our office or in a classroom and we get a call saying, there's a child who's being screened right now, and we really would like one of you to take a listen. Can you come on down? So we do that. We do a lot of the making of visuals for families and for staff members that need visual supports for their students. We spend a lot of time doing augmentative communication, device management, or low-tech system management and collaboration with outside providers of those services. Myself, I'm on the PBIS 1 team, so I meet with that team once a month. And I'm also on the school leadership team, which meets at minimum once a month, but it's usually more than that. And we're the people that are responsible for providing professional development for our school on school improvement days, or also sometimes during our staff meetings. All SLPs and actually all our staff in the whole school are involved in weekly collaboration meetings. So as Elise alluded to, we have 4 classrooms per village that we call them. And usually an SLP has 4 classrooms in 1 village. And each day of the week, usually we have a collaboration meeting with 1 classroom. So that would include the classroom teacher, ourselves, usually the social worker, our CODA and paraprofessionals. And then as needed, we would invite in people that are more district-wide related services. So they're not here every day. So we would invite them when we need to hear from them, which is like physical therapists, deaf and hard of hearing teachers, our bilingual specialists, those extra staff members that don't see all the kids in the classroom. Another thing that is big here is that Elise, myself, and our other speech pathologist, Patty, we often take the leadership role when it comes to IEPs, because we may have 40 a week or 40 a year that we're doing, and our classroom teachers are, yes, they're dually certified in special ed, but they may have only 5 a year that they do. So oftentimes we are the ones that they go to for support, and that we help them with IEPs because we're more familiar with the paperwork. And then also we do some training with our staff in each of the classrooms so that we have some time to give them some role release where we're not always the ones taking care of everything, because as I think you would all know, that communication doesn't just stop when the speech pathologist leaves the room. It continues through all the kids are in the school. So we want to make sure that everyone knows what their role is.
Okay, so one of the topics that we wanted to talk about with inclusion is that I think there's this tradition that speech and language therapy is provided in a pull-out service. I think it just started that way, and it's still the setting that is, it's still the model that's used in clinical settings. And there's also this idea that therapy is true therapy when you're pulling them out. But really, that philosophy is just not what we have at our school. We think that inclusion is actually more beneficial and I guess more therapy than they would get in a pull-out kind of situation, especially for students that have significant needs and that are working on lots of different goals outside of communication. So it's not that we never use that pull-out method, but it's almost never used for those students that have more than just articulation goals. So we are using that inclusion push-in services for students that have, OT, PT, and then also our PT and our OT are using that inclusion push-in method as well. And the way that we kind of do that is that we have to be very intentional about it. So we have to think about, okay, when we're scheduling, when is the natural time for communication to happen the most? Even though it's happening all the time, I may prioritize seeing that student during a free play session time instead of gym time. So at gym time, our physical therapist would then kind of take more precedence over that time, because that's more of a natural time for her to do push-in therapy for that gym time. And then our administrator kind of manages our schedule in the sense of she manages when our gross motor and library schedule is, but then the classroom teachers decide what the rest of the schedule, the rest of the days and days of the week look like. And then once we get that schedule, which is typically after about the first week of school, then all the therapists are creating their schedules to come up with a plan of how can we all find natural ways to work on the goals that these students are working on in our area. And then if there's a conflict, we will kind of talk about, okay, well, who's here more, who has more flexibility, who has less flexibility. So I have more flexibility because I'm here full time versus our physical therapist is only here once or twice a week. So I would definitely give up that time and try to rearrange my schedule to make sure that that student gets that particular time with the physical therapist. And then I think it just really takes a mindset shift, and it's just part of our culture in our school that push in is what we do. And when there's that culture and that just that expectation, when you see it being done, it just becomes so much easier, and it's just very natural. So
thank you for that. So now we've had a little bit of an overview of Urbana and your roles specifically, and I just wanted to talk for a second about kind of highlighting what the focus of this webinar is about, which are evidence-based practices. So as we continue now, we're going to be listening to more from Katie and Elise about what they do at Urbana. And these are some of the things that they will be highlighting for us, is how they use diverse instructional practices, which they kind of already were talking about. They tailor things based on individual children's needs. Groups are flexible and based on the needs of individual children. And again, those special education supports related services are embedded in the classroom. Related services are provided within the routine. Excuse me, and children's progress is continually monitored through authentic assessment. So as we continue on now in our webinar, kind of hold these in your mind. These are the best practices that we were using to frame up today. And then our What Makes Inclusion Work practices that I just were talking about were drawn from several different sources, but one of them was the DEC Recommended Practices. And we just wanted to alert you, one, to these because they're very useful when you're trying to decide what practices to put in place in your program. And two, to help us talk about what Katie and Elise and their team do so well. So if you do not have a copy of this, I'm going to put in chat a link for you to go online and download it. It is free and available to you. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go back so we're not distracted. We picked a few recommended practices from the Division of Early Childhood, and we're going to talk about them individually and allow Elise and Katie to kind of fill us in what it looks like in practice. And then we will pause and give you a chance to ask questions. So we didn't want to wait to the end, because if you're like me, you'll think of a bunch of questions and they get kind of jumbled. So we're going to be pausing after each one of the practices to give you a chance to either go in the chat or turn on your microphone and ask them a question. So the first practice that we discussed talking about today is that practitioners gather and use data to inform their decisions about individualized instruction. So I'm going to hand it back over so they can share with us what they are doing to support this practice.
Well, it's kind of funny that we have to talk about this because I am on the school leadership team, like I mentioned, and we've been having discussion after discussion after discussion at our program council in the district and here about data. So it's like the word that I hear all the time. So as far as our data that we take, we use multiple models. So personally, and I know Elise does this too, we have our own ways of making our data sheets. I have the goals listed at the top for each of my students, and they each have a sheet, and I have my own way of organizing it. And I take data as I'm working with them either in my therapy room or the classroom on that sheet with a little clipboard. We've used different things, like I take a little notepad outside when I go and work with some of my students outside, or I tape a piece of masking tape to my leg and I make check marks for every time I see something happen that I'm looking for in one of the goals. We do lots of anecdotal data, and that's something that I think our team does really well. So all of our team members know what the goals are for the students in their classroom, and if they have related services or special education services. And so we're always sharing. So if I notice something that a student did that's related to one of the teacher's goals, I will go to her and say, oh, when I was working with so-and-so, I saw them do this. And the teachers do the same. We take videos for each other and say, look at this. I took a video of a student climbing something for the physical therapist because he'd never climbed up a rock wall before, and send that to her. So we do a lot of that kind of sharing as far as data goes and observations. And so the teachers can use that when they're reporting, and their ELS is the system that they use for doing their report cards and data reporting to parents. Sometimes we share data sheets between staff. So maybe one staff member will make a data sheet for looking at the same goal, and we're each collecting information about that goal in our setting or when we're working with the child, and then we combine them together to look at how we each interpreted things and how the child is working on that specific skill when it's different people working with them. So for example, I would say like maybe a student who's working on asking for help. We don't want to just collect it when I'm in there once a week. So the teacher's also collecting information when they're observing the child asking for help as well. And then like I said, we collect notes across settings and partners. So different people are taking different notes and sharing them with each other. And we want to make sure that we're trying to expand what we're working with the kids, not just to one person only, and that multiple partners or multiple adults that they work with are observing the same types of skills, and then they're transferring those skills over to their peers as well. And then we operate on a trimester system with our reporting. So we report on our IEP goals 3 times a year to our families, and that coincides with the times that our teachers send out report cards and ELS reports.
So we're going to open up for questions here, and I'm going to kick things off. Katie, you mentioned that all the staff that work in the classroom know what goals the kids are working on. Mm-hmm. Can you just briefly share with us how everybody knows what goals the kids are working on? Where's it located so people know?
Well, every licensed staff member has access to our IEP system. We use Embrace IEP here. So they can always go in, and we rely on each other to put information into an IEP as well. So it's not like I'm always doing all of the work or the teacher's always doing all of the work in there. And then as far as paraprofessionals, the teacher's almost always sharing the goals with their paraprofessional, either via note or clipboards where they're all listed. Each teacher has their own individual way of doing it, but they're sharing them with their paraprofessionals so we all know what kind of things that the kids are working on. And then we talk about that during our collaboration meetings.
Excellent. Does anyone else have a question for Katie? You can turn your microphone on or pop in the chat.
We've got one in the chat asking what kind of classroom assessment teachers use to report to families. And then what does ELS stand for? Do you guys use the early learning scales? Is that it? So it's early learning scales. I answered one for you, but I'll let you talk about classroom assessment.
So I think different teachers have different assessments that they use. Teacher created things, but they are always reporting it via ELS. And then we have a high population of English language learners in our school. And so we have a separate report card for students who are English language learners. So they get the ELS report, but they also get a report card where the teachers record information about their English language development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, awesome. And Kevi, you raised your hands. If you want, you raised your hand. If you want to turn your mic on and ask your question, please feel free.
How many service teams would an SLP like yourselves be working with in terms of how many classrooms do you typically serve?
So I serve 4 classrooms. And Elise?
Yeah, I'm with 2 classrooms, so it just kind of depends.
And then those each have like an AM and PM section?
Yes.
Yep. And I can tell you the way our school day is set up is that our morning session runs from 9 to 11:30. Mm-hmm. And then we have a break from 11:30 to 1. And then our PM session runs from 1 to 3:30. So that 11:30 to 1 time is when we have our collaboration. It's when we have a lot of IEP meetings. And then it's also the time when people get their lunch break.
Because our team or our program, I believe, visited in Urbana last spring. So your teachers are like classroom case managers typically. You guys all handle your own IEPs, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. We got some more in the chat, Anne.
Yeah, asking about how much time you have to collaborate, which I think you just answered, and how does that work? I don't know if you have anything to add around that collaboration piece.
Well, as far as my team works, so I have the 4 classrooms, and this is kind of the way it was when I came here, and it seemed to work. We just have tweaked it a little bit, is that each day of the week is devoted to a classroom. So if on Mondays, I see all the kids from this classroom. On Tuesdays, I see all the kids from this classroom. And we were having it like, well, then if I'm seeing the kids on that classroom day, from that classroom on that day, that's when I did my large group lesson with them. And then that's when we had collaboration time. So it was like Monday was my day with this person, and I had all the kids then. I had all my large group, and we had collab that day. Last year, we tweaked it a little bit so that I wasn't having collab Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so we split it. So we have 2 on Tuesday, 2 on Thursday. So that I can have time to be on those other teams or actually email lunch while I'm not working, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think we made a shift, definitely. We originally kind of had that whole hour and a half session, and then it was kind of like, well, we're not really getting lunch, we're not getting other meetings in. So there has been a shift where we've done pretty much like 30 to 45 minutes collaboration meetings.
Every week, though.
Every week, yeah, with each classroom. So.
And then somebody else asked about how many students are in each classroom, and then how many of those students have speech and language services. So
we have up to 17.
Yeah, so typically 15, but up to 17. And I would say it depends on the year, but typically there's typically not more than 5. Sometimes we've had 7. That's about as high as I've seen in a classroom, which is almost half the classroom. But yeah, so typically there's about 5 students with speech and language, and that can range from, just articulation goals to functional communication, where they are nonverbal. So.
Thank you. I'm going to scooch us along to our next one because I want to make sure we have time for all you've prepared for us. So Julie?
Yeah, so the next one that we want to focus on is a mouthful. This is really big, and it's about practitioners. And you went into some of this, Katie, how you plan for and provide supports. What is that level of support? The accommodations and adaptations needed for the children to certainly access those preschool environments, that they're participating at a high level, and certainly that they're learning across those activities and routines. So here, you're going to speak to this. So practitioners, you talked a little bit about who might be on the planning team, but some of those people that certainly attend those meetings, like your parapros and your other staff providers, how do they fit in, and how do you look at how you support the students, whether you accommodate, whether you modify, how you do that within a teaming process, so that everyone's feeling good about how the child is progressing. So, and it is across those routines. It's not looking at pulling out those kids most of the time, but it's working within those IEP goals, within that classroom environment, within those natural everyday routines. And so now I think Elise, you was going to speak to that.
Oh, sure. So, and I have a little bit later, kind of a more specific story. But just overall, thinking about, for example, so if we have a child that's working on greeting others, I've done things where I've had my time is the first thing when they come in, so that naturally I'm walking with this student off the bus and we're greeting his friends. And I've set up with the teacher that his job is to be the greeter every other week. So he gets that role because he needs lots of practice with that. And then looking at more of another specific example, I have a student right now that is diagnosed with Rett syndrome. She is nonverbal and she uses a speech generating device to communicate. So it's the PRC Accent 1000. So that's a pretty high tech device that she uses. And we're using it. I only I work with her in the classroom. And one example of doing push-in with her is that I'm coming in during her snack time and working on talking about what she's doing and requesting. So we have on her screen, eat and drink, and she's activating eat every time. And then I am giving her part of her snack, and the teaching assistants and the teacher do the same thing when I'm not there. So that I'm really modeling it for them, and then they can also do it on the days that I'm not in there. And then also transitioning, so going from the classroom to the gym, I am modeling for her go and stop, and having those icons available on her device and really getting her to focus on those models and those icons. And then also during center time, working on want and stop, or even during like a large group time, she might have kind of another activity to kind of keep her engaged. So she might have some other different toys and things that she's looking at and figuring out puzzles. So she might use her device then to say, like, I want, a toy, and just activating that want picture icon. And then again, we talked a lot about, actually today during our collaboration meeting, about getting better at modeling on her device during group times. So one way we talked about that was that, so for example, even if it's just at the end of answering a question and she's able to say yes or no on her device, modeling that for her and giving her that opportunity to participate in the group activity. And then we also talked about, there's different things on there like colors, and just really thinking about how can we use what is available on her device for everyday situations. And then also she has a sensory snack that helps her regulate. And again, I'm coming in during that time to work with her. So I actually work with my students most of the time twice. I split their time into 2 separate sessions so that I can kind of get different times of day for them.
So we want to open it up again for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question yourself, or if you need to rely on the chat, that's okay too. But we'd certainly like to hear from you at this point.
You guys see Allison asked about tell me more about the sensory snack.
Yeah, so this student, she needs a lot of oral stimulation. She's often biting, not really like to bite others, to be hurtful, but she's often moving her mouth and trying to bite. And she seems to be more regulated and calm when and we have like a chewy necklace for her to use to really get that input she likes to just really get her teeth down on something. That seems to help, but she also needs more than that. And we found that having food helps her to do that. The foods are typically crunchy and dry. That just seems to kind of meet her needs. So we're saying, okay, she needs this sensory snack to regulate herself and get that stimulation. So we're going to also add communication into that sensory snack.
And then there's a question about the teachers trained to use the communication device.
Yes. Yes. So we talk about this in our collaboration meetings. And actually today we got permission from this little girl's parent to hold on to the device because we felt for a collaboration meeting, because we felt that it would be more beneficial to have the device for the team to look at and manipulate and play around with when she's not there, because it's hard to interact with her when we're trying to figure out what's on her device and how we can target things. So we did take that time today during our collaboration time to really look around her device and talk about how we're using it in the classroom. And my therapy sessions, because they're in the classroom, those teaching assistants and teacher can also see what I'm doing and directly observe that. And they've done that where they've, taken turns kind of sitting and watching a session with me to really help make that look easier, to give them an example for when I'm not there.
Okay.
Anna, did you have another one?
No.
Okay. So it sounds like, listening to what you were just saying, to make that work, there was a bunch of strategies in place. Mm-hmm. So one of them was the flexibility in your partnership, that the teacher allows for some flexibility in terms of having multiple snacks in the classroom. Mm-hmm. A strong collaboration with the family. They must really trust you if they allowed you to keep her device for a while today.
Yeah, we have to look it up. Yeah.
You had those IEP goal discussions, and then that collaboration, I keep hearing it again and again, how that is like worth its weight in gold for what you're doing.
It's really protected time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I call it. It's set aside protected time that we have every week, and we try not to interfere, so that we make sure that we at least at minimum have that 30 minutes a week where we can all get together and talk about these students that have discussions about.
And I think when we have new professionals come in, that's like the one thing that they're always really excited about and feel supported. They feel so much more supported because we have that allotted time to really, talk to everyone on the team and bounce back ideas. And it just kind of makes it like we're all in it together.
So I want to go back to the very first slide that Julie was sharing, that you have no self-contained settings, which means you have no segregated settings for children with disabilities. So the story you just shared with that young girl with Rett syndrome, she has multiple needs going on. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like for this to work, having that protected team time is absolutely key. We have some administrators listening today that are building their inclusion team or their inclusion program. And so as a listener here to what you're sharing with me, that seems to be a huge takeaway.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, Julie, want to do our next slide? I'll hop us over.
Okay, right. So, I think I went over this one just quickly, but let's talk about it again. You did go into some of this. So it's the practitioners, which if you define that, who are the practitioners? is it all the people that come in touch with the child every day, and oftentimes those are our parapros too. So I was kind of wondering if you would just speak to their role on the team, and then and then talking about embedding that instruction within the natural natural context of what goes on in the classroom, and taking advantage of those opportunities. And then also too, I know in planning for this, we talked a little bit about the team makeup and how you communicate, because I know not everybody can attend every meeting. And boy, you guys, we know this is working. So this communication system that you've worked out, there must be many, many pieces. So when you can't be at a meeting, how do you add to the agenda so your voices and questions are being heard? And how do you, for instance, like make sure everybody gets a copy of the notes, and so everyone knows what decisions were made, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so we often joke that we have meetings about meetings because we have so many meetings. So yes, there are definitely times where I'm not able to make it to a meeting. And when that happens, typically some of our teachers will send out an agenda, or some people who are on the team, anyone can kind of say, I'd really like to talk about this at Collab, so that we can really prioritize our next collaboration meeting and stay on track. So that's really nice when we have an agenda that's set out ahead of time. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, it helps us to kind of all decide, is this, so for example, if we have our physical therapist who can only attend one meeting on the day that she's there, can kind of look across and see where she's most needed. And then when every teacher takes notes on the collaboration meeting to summarize during the meeting what we agreed upon, what we talked about, so then that way we can also see kind of reminders of what we promised to do during that meeting. So those notes are sent out and shared usually through like a Google Drive document. So that's usually how we make sure that if we're not there, we can still attend and get those needs met.
So I think, Katie, you had some more anecdotes to tell us about some kids in your practice that you're including.
Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about how I embed some of these practices in our everyday preschool routine. So I think we're kind of lucky in pre-K that we have the structure that we do, because it allows for this so easily. So I currently actually have 3 boys with autism who are all in various states of verbally, nonverbal to limited verbal between those 3 boys. But they all communicate with PECs, and our whole school is trained in PECs. So I made them all their own PECs books. Their pictures are tailored to what they like and what they need. And I will note that Elise is the mastermind of this, but we have modified PECs books that are made from more everyday materials, not the ones that we have to order from the company that cost like $40 per book. So anyway, so my speech sessions with these students might consist of individual therapy time with me in the classroom, sometimes out, but it also includes the classroom staff. So especially when you're working in the first few phases of PECs, if you're doing it with Fidelity, you need more than one person to serve as communication partner and physical prompter. And so that's a natural time to embed your therapy into the classroom, because you need to have someone else to help you. I do it in multiple settings where I go out on the playground with my little boys, and they are requesting to be pushed on the swing with their book, or they're requesting me to chase them and tickle them, or they want a ball. And so I start with myself, but then also we can try to get peers involved in that. And I actually have a student right now who has a favorite friend in the classroom, and he has a picture of him in his PECs book. And so he can pull down, he makes sentences now, and he can pull down, I want tickle from Jay, and hand the sentence strip and hand it over to the friend. And we've trained the peer to accept that and then chase him and tickle him. And it's a really cool interaction to see. And so we try to do that in multiple places. We problem solve like where we can use some of these strategies and when is the most appropriate, because it's not always going to be possible. And we want to make sure we do this so that we don't only get stuck in one thing. So what tends to happen a lot of times, especially with these kids with PECs, is that they are always just requesting snack. I want crackers, I want crackers, I want crackers, and we never use it any other time. And so that's when we problem solve together so that we can figure out, well, where are other times that it can be used? And so when I do my therapy, I'm modeling those other times and other items that they can request, other people that they can request, so that the teacher and the paraprofessionals can use those as well. Let's see. And then some of these students are starting to use some spoken words now in the classroom, and so then we share that. So a new boy has probably gained 4 or 5 verbal words, and one of his words is book, which he whispers, but he has a favorite book, and when a peer has that book, we're helping him learn to go over to that friend and say book to that friend so that maybe they can trade, and just facilitating some of those kinds of things. And then like I said, I just show it to the staff, and then I monitor when I'm there and what the student's doing, and then show the teachers what I'm doing, or the teaching assistants, and then they can take over when I'm not able to be there.
We had a pause here for any questions folks have about the last couple stories that Katie and Elise have shared. Did anyone have questions?
We've got one from the chat about what's the student-teacher ratio in your program?
So we're really lucky. We have 1 classroom teacher and 2 teaching assistants in every classroom. And that's new. That is a newer thing.
This is our second year. This year, the second year.
Yeah.
And that has been wonderful, because we've been able to say, you're not just in here for this student, everyone's in here for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
for every child. So, and that's been really a easy shift, because we just naturally have that many people in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And how many students? Again, did you say 16, 17?
Up to 17, but most of our classes have 15.
15 to 17. Okay.
And some of those staff, they're not labeled as one-on-one, but they do serve as a one-on-one type of capacity with a student with significant disabilities if that's needed. But the thing that's nice now is they're not labeled as that, so that person is very flexible. So it can be the teacher for half an hour, or it can be this one teaching assistant or another teaching assistant. So they're spread out, and it's not always the same person.
I think we wanted to have you talk a little bit more about your embedded services, because just a little bit painting the picture a little bit more. You've done a great job so far describing, but if I was a speech pathologist, I would want to know what it looks like for you guys when you're working. Can you share a little bit about these things that you do?
Sure. So again, I go into the classroom, each classroom session once per week, and do a large group language lesson or something to do with speech sounds. And it's something that's embedded into the classroom routine, the classroom schedule. So in one classroom, every Tuesday, I am there at their closing group time. So that is really, really cool, because I'm working on, just any kind of, I typically choose targets that are things that students on my caseload are working on. So I'm targeting kind of those kids, but I'm also targeting the whole class to kind of see where they're at as well. And during that time, it's really cool because you can just pull out something that you notice in the classroom that a student is working on. So, for example, I had a group that I did this week about describing, and we read a story about using different adjectives and really using that language to describe. And during that, we had one of my students shout out an answer, and they had to try again because they, had to use the sound that they've been practicing. And then when they get that sound right, the whole class, I encourage them to say, give him a thumbs up. He's working on that sound, and he just did that sound for you guys. And then we all kind of talk about the sound. So it really gives us that opportunity to look at what those kids are working on with me in that larger context. And then it also really is nice because I get to know all the kids, briefly, but I definitely get to be familiar and a familiar and routine person in that classroom, so that when a student is identified as needing a speech and language evaluation, we've already established that relationship, and they're very comfortable with getting to know me more and coming with me and doing some assessments. And then another thing that's really great is that we can involve other kids. We're involving students that don't have disabilities as those models for our students that are on our caseload. And then this is kind of aside from the large group, but again, just finding ways to work with the teacher about how to get students working on their speech and language goal by just kind of shifting things like jobs. Like I said, I have that one little boy who he is typically you can only be the greeter once every 5 weeks, but he's once every other week because he really needs that practice to greet his peers.
So you all have preschool for all funding, preschool for all expansion, which is full day.
Mm-hmm.
So you have students who are identified as at risk but do not have IEPs.
Yes.
Correct.
So what you're describing is you have an opportunity to provide those large groups, which is an intervention for children who are at risk. You're providing those services without an IEP.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
That's fantastic. So we have one more, which I think the Early Choices team hears a lot from related service staff, that it's a challenge to use systematic instructional strategies with fidelity to teach skills and promote child engagement and learning. How can you use tools to fidelity rather than what you opened with talking about, that therapeutic one-on-one separate setting? So we wanted to know if you could kind of talk a little bit about how, as speech and language pathologists, how you're able to do this. Oopsie. Sorry.
So I would say that if it's a speech and language skill, what we do is that we provide the initial instruction to the student. And that may, in all reality, be a time that they come out of the classroom if we're teaching a new skill. But we want to be sure that we don't get stuck in those moments, and that's where we always operate. So something that Elise and I were talking about is that, for example, we're careful that we follow the PECS protocol. We go through the phases. We don't, we try not to skip over things. But we also don't want to discourage other people from trying something. And so when they attempt to use PECS with the student in class after we've modeled it for them, if they don't do it correctly, we don't immediately jump on them and say, no, that's wrong. You can't do PECS that way. So because we don't want to discourage them from trying. So we want to make sure that we offer support. And so then maybe we might talk about it later about a retraining session or a reminder of how you do that part of it. Just so that we try to keep that fidelity, but we're not getting stuck in that and being so rigid about it. And like we incorporate peers, like I was talking about with the little boy and tickling. And we might start with adults to keep the fidelity high, but eventually we know that natural communication is going to be with your peers. And so we want to make sure to incorporate peers as soon as we can, when we know that the child's skill is more solid. And then we also have a lot of other goals, like social language goals that we might use. And so we use those, I mean, because I think we talk a lot about kids that are nonverbal, but Elise and I see many other students. So we want to make sure that we embed some of those social language skills into their everyday functioning as well. And so, we might work on things like greeting a student at the door, like Elise does, but I also do something where I have one of my students that was working on social language go up to a friend and ask if they want to play the activity that I brought into the classroom. And so we use some of those skills to promote their engagement in the classroom, but we don't have to feel like we get stuck doing only one thing and only one way.
Thank you for that. So Julie, we're going to talk a little about families now.
Sure. So we know that involving families is really, really important. And families can be tremendous assets to us as teams. And so how is it that you involve your families? Do you involve them as part of your planning? How do you communicate with them on a regular basis? So what's your process? And I see you've got an example you're going to share with us on how you communicate with your families.
Yeah, so I mean, we always encourage families to come in. We have an open door policy that they can come in whenever and observe. And we also let them, or I also encourage them to come during a therapy session time, so I can model and they can see. But if they're not able to do that, which is often the case, we duplicate things for them. So for example, if a student is using certain visuals at school, we can duplicate those visuals at home, so that they can kind of have like a communication book at school and then maybe a separate one for home, based on just focusing on, I've said to families, okay, what are 5 things that your child really, really likes? And let's focus on those. I'll make you pictures and then you can use those at home. And then also talking about, thinking about family names for targets for different sounds. So if your child has a sibling named Caden, then you can really work on that k sound, because that's really meaningful for them and is probably more meaningful than some of the other words that have a K in them. And then also Katie made this visual and I use it as well. And I think it's great because it's something that we can quickly go over and the kids can participate as well. So it has their name, the date, and then we can, just choose from a close-ended list of activities with pictures so the kids can kind of recap what happened, what did we do, and then we also can reiterate with them, okay, what did we work on? What was our goal? And then at home, I want you, you're going to share this with, and then we talk about who they can share it with at home, and then we write a little note for the parent to, even if it's just a list of words or something like that, to work on at home. And then it also gives us that opportunity for them to self-reflect if they followed expectations, being able to sit down, listen, work, and talk about how successful their session was.
And I can say that as far as like collaboration with community partners or community providers, we have, in the Champaign-Urbana area, there's a lot of providers that we have access, that our students have access to, our families have access to. And I'd like to think that we have a pretty good relationship with them. I just emailed the speech therapist at Carl this morning, which is the outpatient therapy services that the child also receives. So we have a lot of those open lines. But one of my more recent students attends Head Start in the morning and then comes here in the afternoon because she's a student with a developmental disability. And at our last annual review, we were able to arrange it at a time where mom, all our school staff, and 3 staff members from Head Start were able to come to the annual review, and we could all share our observations together and problem solve on a few things that were happening with her. And it was a really awesome time, and probably one of the best annual reviews I've ever been in. So just because everybody was there able to share, and then we were able to give them some things and strategies that we were working on, and then they were able to share with us some of the things that they were doing with her, and it was a great time to work together. So
That's great. Do we want these questions from the chat?
Yes.
So there's back a little bit. Somebody asked about you talked about some phonemic awareness things, and so they were asking if you had any phonemic awareness resources that you recommend.
A great question. I don't have anything specifically. We are talking about that in our school development plan. I have some books that I could probably share that I've used. One of them is One Duck Stuck, is really good for that k sound. And then the Popcorn Shop is a Scholastic book that is really good for that p sound. That's all I can think of at the top of my head, but
that's okay. If you come up with some like great list or something, we can also send it out to all the participants after too. So, and then just to clarify, Sarah asked around working with students who are not on your caseload, but you have concerns about. Do you work with them individually other than just the whole group? So if there's somebody you got a concern, would you work individually with them without?
No, typically we would need consent to work with them individually outside of the classroom. So the way we can get around that is that we're doing observations during the day. So typically I go in during a center time where they're doing free play, and I will just play because that's what they would typically be doing anyway. So I'm just playing with them and just taking notes if I have concerns.
Mm-hmm. And then the last question we have is around your classroom. And so you guys might not know this as speech therapists. This might be more of something that your administrator would know. But how many students with an IEP are managed by the case manager? And then how many are speech only in a classroom? And then do you have kiddos with IEPs, kiddos at risk, and then I don't know if you guys have a tuition-based program. Do you have any typically developing kids? No. Okay, so it's all PFA or.
We do have, we do have itinerant students, but they are getting speech services, so they do have an IEP, but they don't attend our school.
Yeah.
And they don't have risk factors yet.
Yeah. So do you know about the case management from the teacher end of things, or?
The teacher generally case manages any student who's not speech language impaired as their primary disability, unless it might be hearing impairment or vision impairment, and then that would be a deaf of hardened hearing teacher or vision itinerant teacher. So any student that has autism, developmental delay, OHI, any of those kinds of things, the classroom teacher is the case manager.
Okay. I think that answered it.
Yeah.
All right.
So the IEP process, we know that certainly writing goals is very important, and especially goals that work in inclusive settings like what Elise and Katie are talking about. And a big part of what they do is training for team members on how to write those goals and those present levels of functioning. Would you like to speak to that? I think, Katie, was you going to share?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we often work together to write our IEP goals, even if they're really going to be collected information by one person or one person's going to be responsible for them. We use some of our collaboration time to write some of those goals as the IEP meetings come up throughout the year. But we try to write goals that will be useful and helpful to a student in the classroom as well as out. So Lisa and I just thought of some examples that we have used. So one would be like a student will use socially appropriate language to greet peers or adults in 4 out of 5 trials. And then the objectives might be more specific things like using a wave or using a verbal greeting or initiating versus responding, so that they're broken down. Another one is that by a certain time, the student will independently use a 3-word phrase or sentence to request or comment in at least 4 out of 5 trials. And you can see that anyone can really work towards that because it's something that occurs naturally throughout the day. I would just be maybe the one that would be collecting the data for reporting later on to see how their progress is. And as far as professional development, I was part of a team this year that did an IEP audit for our district, where every special education service provider had to submit one IEP that they wrote this year. And then our team went through and used a rubric to analyze every single IEP that we received. And the purpose is that we will eventually be providing support for staff. It wasn't like, I got you, like you didn't do this right, but it was like, what do we need to look at that our district really needs to provide to staff in the future? And what's kind of come out of that is that we need more support in writing present levels well. And then after you've written present levels very well, you can easily write your goals well. And so those are some things that I think will be coming up as a focus for our special education staff. And I guess also something that we had talked about mentioning was that we have a lot of support provided for our staff here. So like our principal, Chris, meets with every new teacher every week for the entire first semester, and then as needed after that. And then during our collaboration meetings, we provide support to each other. So we talk about our IEPs, we talk about how to write goals, we edit with each other so that we're all contributing and that it's not just one person's responsibility, that it's just shared because we all recognize that they're all our students.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to talk about families. I forgot about that part.
Okay, yeah.
So that teachers check in with their families, especially as it's coming up to the annual review. They might call and find out what's your priorities for your student in the next year, especially as they're transitioning to kindergarten. What are you interested in them learning to do in the next year? Those kinds of questions. And then even though it's a law this year, we did it as a practice last year, is that we provide the IEP 3 days in advance to our families before a meeting occurs.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Kevy. Do you have that, Anne? Can you see that? What resource did you use for a rubric?
I would have to check with our director of student services, but it was an ISB rubric. I'm pretty sure that she used, and it was just covering all the parts of the IEP, both procedural and quality.
Well, if you're able to share that with one of us, we can send it to the group.
Sure.
And I see that we're at time.
Yeah, Jody was interested in that. So as we wind down, you had some practices that you wanted to share with people to take away today.
Sure. So one of the things that we talked about a lot is that collaboration and support from all classroom staff is absolutely necessary for inclusion. And then also being flexible. So we talked about, our different service providers are being flexible. If I can't make this time, we're overlapping, we need to change something. And then also quality over quantity. I've learned that with push-in services and with inclusion, you kind of have to let go of needing to get like 30 trials because you know that the quality of that trial, of that interaction, is going to be in that natural setting, and it's really going to mean so much more if that child is doing it in that natural setting. So for example, if they're requesting a marker during sign-in with their communication book, that's so much more meaningful than me pulling them out into my classroom, into my office, and asking for a marker 10 times. And then also just really that strong culture of inclusion, and that's really upheld by our administrator. I think that Chris really has always set that precedence of this is the expectation, and if there are times where there's some pushback, she is supportive of going back to that inclusive model.
I would say when Julie and Emily asked us to do this, Elise and I think both were like, what? It's just what we do. So it's hard to describe it, but it's just because it's embedded in the culture of our school.
Yeah.